welcome to this midweek message. I'm Drew Goins. Today I have with me Pastor Bill Booth. We are continuing our Bible People A to Z. We are at G, and we're going to be on Gehazi, one of those two pronunciations, depending on how you look at it. Do you know what the name means?
I do, but go ahead and share.
Is the Valley of Vision? Is that what you found as well?
That is what I have. That is what I have.
I don't know what that's a reference to, though, if there's more to that or not.
I'm not sure. I didn't find anything beyond that. It may well have been a name of a place.
Okay.
There may have been a symbolism between that place, but it is still ironic that being the servant of a prophet to have the name Valley of Vision. And many of the prophets, of course, had visions. So I find that interesting that his name seemed fitting. So
I guess I see what you're saying now, the Valley of the Vision.
Yes.
I like it. So,
yeah, right.
So we are going to, he appears initially in, I think, 2 Kings chapter 5 is where we're going to be a little bit.
Okay.
So his primary role is a trusted representative and a messenger for Elijah.
Yes,
Elisha.
Yes.
Elisha. Do you want to tell us a little bit?
Yeah, let's take a brief sidebar here and talk a little bit about the prophets. Because we have two prophets here that sound amazingly the same to us. And so you have Elijah and Elisha. So you have a J and an S, right? And so these are the two prophets. And so I, for myself, just have to kind of remember that alphabetically for us, J comes before S, and that's kind of the order in which they come. But I think it's important to just very quickly do a sidebar here and talk about the two prophets. So Elijah is the first prophet, and in many ways his stature is the greater of the prophets in the sense that we hear about him again in the New Testament. We hear about him multiple times. We have a correlation between him and John the Baptist in terms of a forerunner or messenger. We also at Transfiguration have an image, and this is the one for whom they leave a table place setting when they do the meals, the open seat for the prophet Elijah. So he is by stature the greater of the two in that regard. However, the truth is, he kind of comes from nowhere. We don't know much about him. And then his ministry is relatively short in terms of years that we can track. So then he is in the midst of everything else that happens to him. He's also the dramatic one who had the showdown with the prophets of Baal and called down fire from heaven, and et cetera. So, I mean, it's a pretty dramatic guy. A lot of times in the outskirts, he's always kind of on the peripheries, showing up to confront one of the most corrupt kings and queens of Ahab and Jezebel that were there. And so, I mean, he had a very contentious relationship. But God said to him, "You will appoint your successor, who will be Elisha." Elisha, by all accounts, came from a pretty well-to-do family. The very fact that when they meet, he actually is plowing with like 12 pair of ox. I mean, clearly he was.
So there's family wealth.
There's family wealth. He has this position, but he immediately leaves all of that and goes to follow when God anoints him to do so. And then Elisha is there when Elijah is taken into heaven and receives his mantle, and he prayed for a double portion. And so, roughly speaking, you look at the credited miracles of Elijah and the credited miracles of Elisha, and they're virtually double. So it's kind of a symbolic way of saying that, you know, he really was given this extra portion and able to do that. In many ways, Elisha did more common day kind of miracles, and if ever there's such a thing. But he did it for the widow. He did it for, I mean, you see him over and over again, whereas you see Elijah in the face of kings and doing these things. Elisha is more commonly seen sort of among the people and doing those sort of things. So there's a different kind of an image, even though both had that opportunity and to be in front of leaders. So that's just sort of a quick excursus or side note on those two, because I think it's important. And we're dealing with Elisha today because Gehazi was the servant of, or probably the main servant of Elisha.
So that kind of gets us to our story today. So
sure.
Naaman is a mighty warrior with the king's favor, but has leprosy.
Yes.
So then this Israelite slave says, "Hey, there's somebody that can heal him."
Right.
And so word gets back to the king, somebody can heal him. So the king sends Naaman and a bunch of riches. So 750 pounds of silver, 150 pounds of gold, and says, if he hears someone can help him, and here it is, if he wills it. So he sends Naaman to travel to Elisha's house.
Elisha, yes.
Elisha's, and Elijah sends a messenger to greet him, and says,
Yes.
he doesn't even come out to see him. He says,
Right.
the messenger, dip in the water 7 times and you'll be healed.
In the Jordan.
In the Jordan, and
Yes.
so
Yes. Yes.
Naaman's like, again, a mighty warrior. He's like, what? This guy can't even come see me? He sends a messenger to do that?
Yes.
So he's upset. But again, the Israelites are, hey, let's just give it a shot. We've heard about this guy. We know it's good. So he does it, and sure enough, 7th time, he's healed.
Yes.
So now he goes back,
Yes.
and he's like, okay, here's all these gifts that we want to give you. Thank you for healing me.
Right.
And Elijah says, it's okay. You keep the gifts, basically, and sends him on his way.
Right.
Is that pretty good background of where we are?
No, absolutely. I think just also I would expand to say, remember, Naaman is a foreigner. He comes from a foreign power, a foreign country, that you have to imagine that all the tensions that are happening in this region, this is a commander of armies that probably at one time had conflicted with Israel and Judah. And so you have all of a sudden this guy coming to be healed. And you almost hear that in his contempt for, I got better rivers in my own country.
Oh yes.
Where I can go dip 7 times. Why would I do it in this?
Here, yes. Yeah.
And so you have that, and then the servants who are brazen enough to say to their leader and commander, look, if he'd asked you to do this amazing thing, you would have climbed the highest mountain. And here he asks you to do this simple thing, and you're not going to do it.
Yeah.
So they almost goad him into giving it a try.
That's a good point too.
Which is pretty funny to me. So yeah, I think that's a good telling. Yeah.
So then now comes the introduction of our main character today.
Sure.
We get to so Gehazi sees all this and thinks, oh man, he just let all that silver go and all that gold. So I just did, before we talked, I Googled what 750 pounds of silver was worth.
Right.
And it said $250,000. So it's not as much as I thought it would. I Googled what 150 pounds of gold would today. Yeah. $4.5 million. So I was like, okay, that's a little bit more.
Yeah.
So we get to verse 20 again in 2 Kings 5, and there's a button there, and it's like, but Gehazi, the servant of Elisha, ran to the man and said, hey, my master, he actually wants this money, so if you could send some money back.
But tell him why. Read it.
Yes, because he's going to, I'll just read it. See, my master has spared this Naaman, the Syrian, and in not accepting his hand and what he brought. As the Lord lives, I will run after him and get something for him. So he followed him and said, hey, is everything well? This is skipping down.
Yeah.
And he said, all is well. My master sent me to say, they have just now come from the hill of the country of Ephraim, 2 young men and the sons of prophet. Please give them a talent of silver and 2 changes of clothing. So he says, hey, we're going to do some good. There's this guy. We're going to help.
So he makes up a lie.
Yes.
So he's going to get it, but he even lies here to say these 2 prophets came to us out of nowhere, and we can't do anything for them. Could we? I mean, in other words, he's not even just coming back to say, oh, look, we've changed our mind. It's like, no, this happened after you left.
This grand scheme of, we need it, and we need it now.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So Naaman sends it back with Gehazi, and so much so that he actually sends 2 servants back with him just to carry all the stuff.
Right.
And Gehazi hides the money in his house. And then it gets to Elisha, says, hey, where have you been?
That's right.
And the greatest response ever, I've been nowhere. Like, if anyone ever tells you I've been nowhere, it's probably a lie.
And they're in trouble, man. They're in trouble. Yeah.
So then my notes say, then Elijah drops the hammer. So is that fair? So,
absolutely.
So tell us what happens from there. So
well, let's back up though. Let's also talk about the interesting correlation between this image of Elisha saying to Gehazi, so where you been? What you been up to? Mm-hmm. Think about that in relationship to the Adam and Eve story.
Oh.
God shows up and says, so what you been doing? What's going on?
That's a good point.
And even Cain and Abel, where's your brother? And so kind of this interesting
asking questions.
Yeah, just asking a question the answer to. So anyway, at that point he denies it, or he lies, and then the prophet calls him on it and says, I know what you've done. And he said, was not my spirit with you? Isn't that crazy? He says, was not
Oh.
my spirit with you when you did that? That's kind of spooky in a way.
It is. Yeah.
And then he says, so now you and your family are going to get to have the leprosy.
That Naaman, yes.
Naaman. So Naaman laid it down in the river. You just picked it up. And so, boom, there you go.
Yep. So verse 27 says, the leprosy of Naaman shall cling to you and your descendants forever. So he went out from his presence like a leper, like snow. So, and then all of a sudden, Gehazi has this.
Yeah. So I think a couple things. I mean, let's also acknowledge there were some things that he was a servant, and he obviously was trusted to be maybe one of the main servants. So he obviously had done a few things right along the way.
Sure.
We see him in other places. We also see him where there's a healing of a child, but he is sent with the prophet's staff to go heal a child, but it is not successful. The prophet comes, but by all accounts, this was a hard healing, because if you read the story, you know whatever that means. But I mean, it was not your just like send a word and it gets done kind of thing. There was something more had to happen there. So, but anyway, there are images here, and there's another place where we see him show up again, and he's actually bearing witness again on behalf of miracles the prophet has done, and it's a little bit odd because it's after this event. And so some have suggested maybe that was not chronologically in the correct place, and because he actually shows up in the court of the king, which it would be almost impossible if he has leprosy. And the woman who the prophet had sent out of the region because of the famine has come back, and now all of her land's been taken. And she says, but wait, the prophet had me do this. And then he steps up and says, oh, yes, the prophet did that. And he speaks on her behalf, and she gets her lands restored, and et cetera. So you almost wonder if that was kind of something that they were recounting, that this was
looking
you reach
backwards,
that point, and it was a looking back kind of a moment, which happens occasionally. So we see him in some different places. So I mean, he had some value, a virtue at some point, but clearly this was a moment that overtook him. And
Sure.
But I would suggest that those seeds were already there all along. I mean, it's just finally accumulated. And also, if we think about the fact that Elisha had come from wealth and now was choosing this lifestyle, Gehazi might have said, you can't really appreciate what it is to be poor. You can't appreciate what it is to be like me.
The opportunity, quote unquote,
and do that.
Air quotes there.
But that's me reading into his mind, which I can't do. But
That's okay. I mean,
you get the idea.
yeah.
So yeah, sure.
So that's kind of with my application pieces with that. So we referenced. Mine is, I'm going to do this comparison between Gehazi and the servants of Nahum.
Okay.
So they haven't even, the servants of Nahum I've only heard about. There's this prophet that can heal you. And they coach him into this. They convince him of it. Where Gehazi witnessed firsthand Elisha raising a child from the dead.
Correct.
So it's one of those things. It's like he had firsthand experience and missed and got off the path, whereas those that didn't have that hands-on visual experience kind of stayed true to the course, if that's fair. So that's my encouragement today, would be like, you may not have the firsthand experience, or you may hear about this other thing, but don't venture off course. So
yeah. So I think that's great. I think that's a great thing to think about, and even as some extra reading I was doing, talked about the Talmud, which is some historical, extra biblical, but kind of writings, Jewish writings, and they basically refer to Gehazi as one who fell from grace, and they said was not even afforded the means of repentance, is the way they talked about him. And then they give some examples which are kind of way off in the weeds, and I'm not going to do that because some of them are really odd stories. But the gist of them is that he really was not faithful to his master, and he was not faithful to the faith, and he did that, and as a result, this is what happened. But I did find another interesting tidbit in the rabbinic traditions. There is a way in which Gehazi is actually identified as one of the four lepers that we see in 2 Kings 7, 3-8. What happens, the Syrians have taken or have come to attack, and the people are trapped inside the Jewish people are trapped, and so they're calling out for God's help, and they're starving. I mean, because they're basically being shut off from all their food, and they're crying out for help, and the prophet's telling them that God will provide, and God sends confusion in the Syrians, and they basically break camp and run, and they leave all of their stuff out there. And so while people are trapped inside the city starving, there are these 4 lepers who come across the empty camp with all the food, and they start taking the food and taking all the stuff. And finally, one of them says, "How is it that we can do this when all our kin are basically," now here they're outcasts because they're lepers, but our kin are dying. So they go to the gate and they tell them about this. And so then the people go out and actually get the goods and are, saved at that point. But the rabbinic tradition says that perhaps Gehazi was and his sons were the ones who the 4 lepers that were represented here. But that's just an aside there. So I don't really know if that's true. But back to your point, I do think that there is a great contrast here between the servants of Nahum, foreign country, not God-fearers that we know of, except that clearly they had enough God-fear in them to come to the prophet to do something.
Or they were desperate enough to.
Or desperate, whichever. But they were faithful to their servant, even to the point of confronting him to say, look, here is an opportunity that we believe would be helpful for you. Why don't you at least give it a try? Versus you have an image of a scheming, conniving Gehazi who tried to do good for himself, and he was just going to, hide it. How did he think he was going to hide all that stuff from the prophet, which is really, really odd. And you're right, the things that he had seen. So I think here again, the real contrast is, the people who had not seen were trusting enough to come give it a try. The one who had seen somehow was jaded enough to not recognize, at the very least, how dangerous it would be to defy this. And let's also be clear that the message that the prophet was sending by not receiving the goods was to say to a foreign entity, there is a God in Israel who you cannot buy.
Mm-hmm.
You can't.
And Naaman gets there.
Yes,
as I read this, he gets there.
Yeah, there's a God that we can't beat and we can't buy, and this is a God who is the God over all these others, not just like some other ones. This prophet is not a charlatan. He's not looking for money. He did this to demonstrate the power. This was God's power demonstrated through the work that happened, and he wanted to be clear that message went back to the highest levels. And so what Gehazi was doing was interfering with that message. And again, the fact that the servant who had been so faithful and been with him could not figure out what the prophet was doing and didn't understand that and how important that was to still try to get his own gain regardless. Yeah.
Well, that was good. That was fun. So
yeah.
I hope you enjoyed listening out there. I hope you're going on this journey of Bible People A to Z with us. Thanks for listening. Stay connected and stay encouraged.